Section 1 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 1. The Psychological Characteristics of Races. Chapter 1. The Soul of Races. How the Naturalists Classify Species. Application of their methods to man. Defective side of the classifications of the human races, at present in vogue. Foundations of a psychological description. The average types of the races. How they may be established by observation. The psychological factors which determine the average type of a race. The influence of ancestors and that of the immediate parents. Common psychological groundwork possessed by all the individuals of a race. Immense influence of bygone generations on the present generation. Mathematical reasons for this influence. How the collective soul has spread from the family to the village, from the city to the surrounding district. Advantages and dangers of the conception of the city. Circumstances under which the formation of the collective soul is impossible. Example of Italy. How the natural races have given way to the historic races. Naturalists base the classification of species on the observation of certain anatomical characteristics, regularly and constantly reproduced by heredity. We are aware today that these characteristics are transformed by the hereditary accumulation of imperceptible changes. Still, if attention be confined to the comparatively short period covered by history, the species may be said to be invariable. Applied to man, the methods of classification of the naturalists have allowed of the determining of a certain number of perfectly distinct types. By the aid of clearly defined anatomical characteristics, such as the color of the skin and the shape and volume of the skull, it has been possible to establish that the human race comprises several species which are quite distinct and probably of very different origin. In the eyes of the scientific men who are respectful of religious traditions, these species are simply races. However, as has been rightly observed, quote, "If the Negro and the Caucasian were snails, all zoologists would affirm unanimously that they constitute excellent species, which could never have descended from the same couple from which they had gradually come to differ." End quote. These anatomical characteristics, those at least of them that can be traced by our analysis, only allow of very summary general divisions. Their divergencies are only perceptible in the case of the most distinct human species, of the white and yellow races or the Negroes, for example. Peoples, however, that closely resemble one another as regards their physique may be widely different as regards their modes of feeling and acting, and in consequence as regards their civilizations, beliefs, and arts. Is it possible, for instance, to class in one and the same group a Spaniard, an Englishman, and an Arab? Are not the mental differences that exist between them apparent to everybody, and to be detected throughout their history? In the absence of anatomical characteristics, it has been proposed to base the classification of certain peoples on various elements, such as language, belief, and political organization. But this mode of classification will scarcely bear examination. The elements of classification which anatomy, languages, environment, or political organization are incapable of furnishing are supplied by psychology, which shows that behind the institutions, arts, beliefs, and political upheavals of each people lie certain moral and intellectual characteristics that determine its evolution. It is the whole of these characteristics that form what may be called the soul of a race. Each race possesses a mental constitution, as unvarying as its anatomical constitution. There seems to be no doubt that the former corresponds to a certain special structure of the brain, but as science is not sufficiently advanced as yet to acquaint us with this structure, we cannot have recourse to it as a basis of classification. Moreover, a knowledge of it would in no way modify the description of the mental constitution of which it is the determining factor, and which is revealed to us by observation. The moral and intellectual characteristics whose association forms the soul of a people represent the synthesis of its entire past, the inheritance of all its ancestors, the motives of its conduct. They appear to be very variable in individuals of the same race. But observation proves that the majority of the individuals of a given race always possess a certain number of common psychological characteristics, which are as stable as the anatomical characteristics that allow of the classification of species. while, like these latter characteristics, the psychological characteristics are regularly and constantly reproduced by heredity. This aggregate of psychological elements observable in all the individuals of a race constitutes what may rightly be called the national character. Together they form the average type which permits of a people being defined. 1,000 Frenchmen, Englishmen, or Chinamen, chosen at hazard, offer notable differences amongst themselves, but nevertheless, owing to racial heredity, they possess common characteristics which allow of the determining of an ideal type of the Frenchman, the Englishman, and the Chinaman, analogous to the ideal type which the naturalist presents when he describes in a general manner the dog or the horse. Applicable to the different varieties of dogs or horses, such a description can only include the characteristics common to them all, and not those which enable their numerous individual specimens to be distinguished. Provided a race be sufficiently ancient and in consequence homogeneous, its average type is established with sufficient clearness for it to be readily noted by the observer. When we visit a foreign people, the only characteristics that can arrest our attention are precisely those that are common to all the inhabitants of the country we are travelling through, since they are the only characteristics that are constantly repeated. The individual characteristics, being seldom repeated, escape us, and before long we not only distinguish at first sight between an Englishman, an Italian, or a Spaniard, but we are perfectly able to ascribe to them certain moral and intellectual characteristics, which are the very fundamental characteristics that we referred to above. An Englishman or a Gascon, an inhabitant of Normandy or Flanders, corresponds to a type of which we have a perfectly clear idea and of which we can easily give a description. Applied to an isolated individual, the description may seem very inadequate and sometimes inexact. Applied to the majority of the individuals of one of these races, it will depict them perfectly. The unconscious process by which we arrive at an idea of the physical and mental type of a people is absolutely identical in its essence with the method by which a naturalist classifies species. This identity of the mental constitution of the majority of the individuals of a race is due to very simple physiological reasons. Each individual is the product not merely of his immediate parents, but also of his race, that is, of the entire series of his ascendants. A learned economist, M. Chiasson, has calculated that in France, supposing there to be 3 generations in a century, each of us would have in his veins the blood of at least 20 millions of the people living in the year 1000. Quote, in consequence, all the inhabitants of a given locality of a given district necessarily possess common ancestors, are moulded of the same clay, bear the same impress, and they are all brought back unceasingly to the average type by this long and heavy chain of which they are merely the last links. We are the children at once of our parents and our race. Our country is our second mother for physiological and hereditary as well as sentimental reasons." Unquote. If it be wished to state in precise language the influences which govern the individual and direct his conduct, they may be said to be of 3 kinds. The first, and certainly the most important, is the influence of ancestors. The second, the influence of the immediate parents. The third, commonly supposed to be the most powerful, but nevertheless the weakest, is the influence of the environment. The influence of environment, including in its scope the various physical and moral influences to which the individual is subjected during his life, and particularly during his education, produces but very slight variations. The influences of environment only become really effective when heredity has caused their action to be continued in the same direction during a long period. Do what he may, then, the individual is always, and above all, the representative of his race. The totality of the ideas and sentiments that are, as it were, the birthright of all the individuals of a given country form the soul of the race. Invisible in its essence, this soul is very visible in its effects, since it determines in reality the entire evolution of a people. A race may be compared to the totality of the cells that constitute a living being. The existence of these milliards of cells is very short, whereas the existence of the being formed by their union is relatively very long. They possess at once their own personal life and a collective life, that of the being of which they form the substance. In the same way, each individual of a race has a very short individual life and a very long collective life. This latter life is that of the race of which he is sprung, which he helps to perpetuate and on which he is always dependent. A race is to be regarded as a permanent being that is independent of time. This permanent being is composed of the long succession of the dead who were its ancestors, as well as of the living individuals who constitute it at a given moment. To understand the true signification of a race, it must be considered with regard both to its past and its future. The dead, besides being infinitely more numerous than the living, are infinitely more powerful. They reign over the vast domain of the unconscious, that invisible domain which exerts its sway over all the manifestations of the intelligence and of character. A people is guided far more by its dead than by its living members. It is by its dead and by its dead alone that a race is founded. Century after century our departed ancestors have fashioned our ideas and sentiments, and in consequence all the motives of our conduct. The generations that have passed away do not bequeath us their physical constitution merely, they also bequeath us their thoughts. The dead are the only undisputed masters of the living. We bear the burden of their mistakes, we reap the reward of their virtues. The formation of the mental constitution of a people does not demand, as does the creation of animal species, those geological periods whose immense duration defies calculation. Still, the time it demands is considerable. To create in such a people as the French, even to the comparatively slight extent accomplished as yet, the community of sentiments and thought that forms its soul, more than 10 centuries have been necessary. Footnote. This lapse of time, long as it may seem from the point of view of history, is in reality comparatively short, since it only represents 30 generations. The reason why so relatively brief an interval is sufficient to fix certain characteristics is that when a cause acts for some length or time in the same direction, it speedily produces very considerable effects. Mathematics teach us that when a cause persistently produces the same effect, the causes increase in arithmetical progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., and the effects in geometrical progression, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. The causes are the logarithms of the effects. In the famous problem of the doubling of the grains of wheat on the squares of a chessboard, the successive numbers of the square are the logarithms of the number of grains of wheat. Similarly, in the case of money invested at compound interest, the number of years in the logarithm of the accumulated capital. It is for reasons of this order that the majority of social phenomena may be expressed by very nearly similar geometrical curves. In another work I arrived at the conclusion that these curves might be expressed analytically by the equation of the parabola or the hyperbola. My learned friend M. Chisson is of the opinion that they are better represented as a rule by an exponential equation. End of footnote. Perhaps the most important result of the French Revolution was to hasten this formation by greatly promoting the breaking up of the minor nationalities. Picards, Flemish, Burgundians, Gascons, Bretons, men of Provence, etc., into which France was formerly divided. Doubtless the unification is far from being complete, and it is more especially because we are composed of two varied races, and in consequence have two different ideas and sentiments, that we are the victims of dissensions unknown to more homogeneous peoples, to the English, for example. In England, the Saxon, the Norman, and the ancient Briton have ended by forming, as the result of fusion, a very homogeneous type, and everything in consequence is homogeneous in the domain of conduct. Thanks to this fusion, the English have acquired in a high degree the three fundamental bases of the soul of the people: common sentiments, common interests, and common beliefs. When a nation has reached this stage, there is an instinctive agreement amongst all its members on all great questions, and it ceases to be a prey to serious dissensions. This community of sentiments, ideas, beliefs, and interests, created by slow hereditary accumulations, gives a high degree of identity and fixity to the mental constitution of a people. It was the cause of the greatness of Rome in ancient times, and at the present day it is the source of the greatness of England. The moment it disappears, peoples begin to break up. The role of Rome was at an end when it ceased to possess it. The congeries of sentiments, ideas, traditions, and beliefs which form the soul of a collectivity of men has always existed, more or less in the case of all peoples and at all ages, but its progressive extension has been slowly accomplished. Restricted at first to the family and gradually extended to the village, the city and the province, the collective soul has only spread to all the inhabitants of a country in comparatively modern times. It was only when this last result had been achieved that the notion of a native country, as we understand it today, came into existence. The notion is not possible until the national soul is formed. The Greeks never got beyond the notion of the city, and their cities were always at war, because in point of fact they were always very foreign to one another. For 2000 years past, India has known no other unity than the village, and it is for this reason that for 2000 years the country has always been subject to foreign rulers, whose ephemeral empires have come to an end as easily as they were formed. Weak though it be from the point of view of military strength, the conception of the city as the sole native country has, on the contrary, always been very effective from the point of view of the development of civilization. Though less spacious than the soul of the native country, the soul of the city has at times been more fruitful. Athens in ancient times, Florence and Venice during the Middle Ages show us the degree of civilization which may be attained to by small agglomerations of men. When small cities or small provinces have lived an independent life for a considerable length of time, they end by possessing so stable a soul that its fusion with those of neighbouring cities and provinces, with a view to the formation of a national soul, becomes almost impossible. Such a fusion, even if it be capable of being brought about, as happens when the elements brought together are not too dissimilar, is never the work of a day, but only that of centuries. To achieve such a work, a Richelieu or a Bismarck is necessary, but they only bring it to a head when it has been long in elaboration. It is possible indeed for a country, as has happened in the case of Italy, to arrive suddenly, as the result of exceptional circumstances, at forming a single state, but it would be a mistake to suppose that it thus acquires simultaneously a national soul. It is clear to me that in Italy there are Piedmontese, Sicilians, Venetians, Romans, etc., but it is not clear as yet that there are Italians. At the present day, whatever be the race under consideration, whether it be homogeneous or not, by the mere fact that it is civilized and for a long while past has played its part in history, it must always be regarded as an artificial and not as a natural race. Natural races are scarcely to be met with except among savages. It is only among savages that it is possible to find peoples of absolute racial purity. At the present day, the majority of civilized races are merely historical races. We are not concerned here with the origin of races. That they have been formed by nature or by history is beyond our purpose. What interests us is their characteristics such as they have been constituted by a long past, kept up during centuries by the same conditions of existence, and accumulated by heredity. These characteristics have ended by acquiring a high degree of fixity and by determining the type of each people. End of section 1.